We all think we know the story of penicillin, right? Messy scientist, a bit of mold, and poof, a revolutionary accident. But what if I told you that's not even half the story? That for a solid decade, the greatest medical discovery in history just sat on a shelf collecting dust? Yeah. Let's get into the real and way more interesting story of penicillin. First, to really get why this matters so much, you have to kind of reset your brain. I want you to imagine a world where a simple scratch from a rose thorn or just scraping your knee on the pavement could literally be a death sentence. That wasn't the Dark Ages. That was the reality for everyone on Earth right up into the 1940s. So before penicillin, doctors were brilliant in many ways, but they were almost helpless against bacterial infections. They could set a bone, sure, but they had no silver bullet, no magic weapon to fight the invisible killers that cause so much suffering. And here's something that might surprise you. The idea of using mold wasn't exactly new. For centuries, ancient Egyptians, Greeks, they'd been packing moldy bread onto wounds. They knew that it worked, but they had no earthly idea why it worked. And without being able to bottle that magic ingredient, medicine was just stuck. A tiny infection could spiral out of control, and all a doctor could do was stand by and hope for the best. Okay, so this brings us to Act 1 of our story. The year is 1928. We're in a London lab, and this is where that famous oops moment happens. All thanks to a scientist who was brilliant, but let's just say he wasn't winning any awards for tidiness. And here he is, meet Alexander Fleming. He was a Scottish researcher at St. Mary's Hospital, and yeah, one look at his lab here tells you everything you need to know. The man was known for his clutter. But in one of history's greatest twists, his messy habits were about to change the world. I just love this quote from the man himself because it really captures how accidental this whole thing was. He'd just gotten back from a summer vacation, walks into his messy lab, and starts sorting through a pile of old Petri dishes he'd forgotten about. He wasn't trying to find a miracle cure, he was just cleaning up. And you really can't overstate how lucky this was. It wasn't just one accident, it was a whole chain of them. The plates had to be left out. A specific mold spore had to float in from another lab downstairs. And then, and this is the crazy part, the London weather had to be completely unseasonal. A cold snap, then a heat wave, in just the right order. The odds of all this happening at once were just astronomical. So what was Fleming's profound, world-changing reaction when he saw that a little patch of mold was killing the deadly bacteria around it? He just looked at it and said, "That's funny." That's it. It has to be one of the biggest understatements in all of scientific history. He'd found a bacteria killer. And look at this. This is the real deal, a sample of the actual original mold from that discovery. It's a direct physical link to that one-in-a-million moment. But here's the thing. This is where the story usually ends, right? Hero makes discovery, roll credits. In reality, this is where everything went wrong. So Fleming had discovered penicillin. He even gave it its name. But the miracle cure that we know today, it didn't happen, not even close. For a full decade, his amazing finding just sat there, a footnote in a science journal that went basically nowhere. So why? Well, it really boiled down to this. Fleming was the perfect person to spot the phenomenon, but he was the wrong person to turn it into a medicine. He was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He couldn't figure out how to get the active ingredient, the mold juice, as he called it, out in a pure form. It was incredibly unstable and a total pain to work with. He published his research and crickets. Nobody really cared. The spark was there, but it just couldn't light the fire. So if Fleming ran into a dead end, who finally broke through? Who were the people who picked up this forgotten clue and turned it into the drug that saved millions? All right, on to Act 2. Let's fast forward 10 years to 1939. We're now at the University of Oxford, where a totally different team of scientists digs up Fleming's old, obscure paper and thinks, hang on a second, what if this is actually a really big deal? And this table just nails the difference between the two parts of the story. Fleming's discovery was pure luck, an accident. The work at Oxford was the exact opposite. It was planned, it was systematic, and it was a team effort. It's the perfect reminder that a breakthrough needs that first flash of insight and the years of hard, grinding work that follow. And this was the team that made it happen. You had Howard Florey, the tough Australian leader who drove the whole project, Ernst Chain, a brilliant biochemist who'd fled Nazi Germany.
He was the one who finally cracked how to purify the stuff. And then you have the unsung hero, Norman Heatley, an absolute genius who basically jerry-rigged their lab equipment out of things like hospital bedpans and biscuit tins to make the first batches. This wasn't a lone genius. This was a scientific A-team.
And they just systematically knocked down every single roadblock that had stopped Fleming. They figured out how to grow the mold in huge vats. Chain perfected a new freeze-drying method that finally made the penicillin stable. They did all the rigorous animal testing to prove it was safe. And then, in 1941, they did it. The first successful human trial. They turned a lab curiosity into an actual, working medicine. But they had a new problem, a huge one. How do you make enough of it? They were making tiny amounts in their lab, but by now the world was in the chaos of World War II. The desperate need for a drug that could stop soldiers from dying of infected wounds, well, that changed everything. The war became the ultimate accelerator. With Britain being bombed, Florey and Heatley secretly traveled to the United States, with mold spores smeared in the lining of their coats. The US government and huge American drug companies jumped in with massive resources. The result? One of the fastest industrial scale-ups in history. By D-Day in 1944, they had made enough penicillin to treat every single Allied soldier wounded in the invasion. Just incredible. And the impact was immediate. Thousands, literally thousands of soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in any other war in history were now surviving. Penicillin wasn't just a clever discovery anymore. On the battlefield, it was a miracle. So, after the war, the world had to decide how to recognize this incredible achievement. But it was a tricky question. Who really deserved the credit? The guy who first noticed it, or the team who actually made it usable? In 1945, the Nobel Committee had to answer that exact question. And you know what? They absolutely got it right. They split the prize 3 ways. Fleming got his for the discovery, but, and this is so important, Florey and Chain were honored for their work on its curative effect. The committee recognized that both parts were essential. The accident needed the industry. The observation needed the science to make it real. This quote just sums up the whole story perfectly. Fleming's discovery was that classic romantic idea of a lone scientist having a eureka moment. But turning that idea into a drug for millions, that required a whole new way of doing science. Big, collaborative, well-funded teams. The story of penicillin isn't just about the past. It kicked off the entire age of antibiotics, changing medicine forever and saving literally hundreds of millions of lives. But it leaves us with a pretty sobering question for today. As we now face the growing crisis of antibiotic resistance, you have to wonder, have we forgotten the lesson of penicillin? Have we started to take this miracle for granted?